I'm Mohamed Cassim. I'm in grade 11 at St. David's, and I will be addressing the Black Lives Matter movement with a particular focus on violence within the movement. To start off, I need to make it clear which violence I'm talking about because much of the violence was not protesters. Police were seen destroying property and buildings, and there were also other individuals who were not associated or part of the movement who were looting, etc. We're not talking about that violence. This conversation is about protesters who are rioting for the movement. So firstly, what is a riot? A riot is a form of civil disorder commonly characterized by a group lashing out in a violent public disturbance against authority, property, or people. Important to note here is that a riot is a form of civil disorder. This means that it has a particular purpose and motive, which is to create societal change within that context. So here, these riots are trying to create systemic change and policy changes that could hopefully reduce oppression, further the goals of the Black Lives Matter movement, and create a world in which we could envision equality being possible. So in having this discussion then, we need to note two things firstly about how the movement has functioned in the past. One, for a long time, protests have been peaceful, and two, many peaceful protests have been turned violent by police. For example, stun grenades were thrown into a peaceful crowd as they were observing a moment of silence for George Floyd and all the other victims of police brutality. I then pose the question, at the point at which these peaceful protests aren't having an impact, what then? What do we do? How do we create this change? How do we further the goals of an important movement like Black Lives Matter? To answer here, we say two things. Firstly, we need to acknowledge that oppression is violent by nature. And when change isn't happening, secondly, even with peaceful protest, a violent response is then something that we'd say is somewhat valid and akin to self-defense. Why do I say this? Some main elements that are required for self-defense to be defendable by law is firstly an unprovoked attack and secondly which threatens imminent injury or death. Oppression is both of these. It is both unprovoked and threatens injury or death, as we've seen with numerous cases of police brutality. We can then conclude that the retaliation is akin to self-defense and is something that we can support and something that becomes very much valid. Furthermore, much of the violence comes from a place of fear for one's life because of the color of your skin, and we think that that's something that's very much valid and is objectively true for many individuals around the world. So now that we understand in principle where the violence comes from and why it ought be a valid response, let's talk about why only talking about the violence is particularly problematic for the movement. Firstly, if you are only focusing on the violence as an individual and only talking about the movement when it is violent, you ought to evaluate which issue is more important, because when you compare the looting that's been going on for maybe a week or two and the lack of rights and access to opportunities that's been going on for centuries, one of them is insignificant, one of them is relatively insignificant, and it certainly isn't Black Lives Matter. Furthermore, you ought to acknowledge that you detract from the real issue when you talk about the movement as being violent. This is because the movement becomes seen as only violent and loses public support. It is untrue to say that the entire movement is now violent and we ought not stop supporting protesters and the movement itself. Condemning all protesters and brushing over the whole movement as simply one that is violent is something we cannot do if we hope to achieve any change within society. The last thing I want to say before I conclude this video is that rioting as a form of civil unrest has been huge in creating change all over the world for a long time. For example, in Umkhonto we Sizwe, was the armed wing of the ANC, co-founded by Nelson Mandela and Walter Sisulu in the wake of the Sharpeville massacre. And this was particularly effective in creating meaningful change through rioting and violent protest. There are numerous other examples of violence and rioting creating meaningful reform throughout history. This isn't about making excuses for violence, but rather about looking at the historical context and creating meaningful reform. I want to end this video off by saying that my understanding is in no way perfect, and I only hope to shed some perspective on the situation. In doing so, I'm open to any constructive criticism or feedback that you may have for me, and I'm also more than willing to have these conversations on an individual level so that we can learn from each other and hopefully create some meaningful change ourselves. In the words of Martin Luther King Jr., riots are the voice of the unheard. Thank you.